Hi, I'm JB,
Hi, I'm Salem.
and welcome to the Beyond the Hill podcast, where we discuss King of the Hill in all of its glory.
More specifically, the happenings of each individual episode and what issues they are trying to address and our opinions on those issues.
Indeed, well put.
Thank you. I watched the pilot a few times this morning. Did you?
Oh, awesome. I've actually seen the pilot, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, but I did not
All
watch it
right.
recently.
Well, you should have. It's fine. Uh, I mentioned before the recording that I was actually a little bit saddened by the pilot and its contents because it's honestly a story about child abuse, and that's not fun for anyone,
No,
obviously.
it's not.
But I I do think that a lot of people, when they perceive the entire series or specifically this episode, have a lot of positive connotations about Hank and actually identify with him a lot. And I came away from it after giving it a really critical eye. I came away identifying Hank as an abusive person. And that's what made me sad because it felt like it was normalizing and glorifying a person who is abusing his family and almost everyone in his life, which was pretty horrifying.
Right.
But I know that a lot of this behavior is extremely normal, and I guess not normal, it's common.
Yeah,
And
common.
I definitely went on IMDb just to see if there were any comments about this one particular episode because there is a huge shift between how they portray Hank in the pilot episode to the rest of the series. He's much quicker to anger in the pilot. I think that he is more mellow in the rest of the episodes, but this thread of him having violent, angry outbursts does come back in later episodes for sure.
Yeah, I agree. In later episodes, I wouldn't say it would be an episode plot point, but they certainly made more of a big deal about him having outbursts. It
Yeah,
wasn't a
there's
constant.
the short synopsis of the plot would be that Hank is supposedly improperly identified to social services as an abusive father,
Mhm.
and Bobby gets a black eye from a baseball game, and in comes the antagonist, which is portrayed as a pencil necked bureaucrat paper pusher
Mhm.
from Los Angeles. And he is so incompetent that he fails to gain any actual evidence in his investigation and is actually fired from his job by his boss for fudging up this whole interview process. I definitely we can just go through a few plot points. Like it
Please
starts
do.
out and we're introduced to characters. It's the very first episode, and Hank's in the very first scene just fixing his truck with his buddies, but when Dale says something stupid, he calls him on it. And he doesn't get angry, but he calls him names for spouting conspiracy theories. And then later we see sort of the establishing character development of trying to make Hank a very authoritarian disciplinarian father and establishing his more conservative moralistic viewpoints. Like Bobby gets a funny phone jerks cassette that he's listening to before his baseball game, and Hank comes in and wants to listen to it, and then he goes on a very disapproving rant about how that's disgusting and bad and how he shouldn't listen to it and how he needs to get rid of that tape, and then immediately runs into a fresh out of the shower Luann in the bathroom and yells at her for not locking the door. So not only does he not like fart noises, he doesn't like people who are not locking the bathroom door. He's very prudish. I have a minor son living in this house. And like, we are supposed to think that's over the top and silly as far as expectations and morals, but he definitely is sort of an everyman in that. He's supposed to be a central point for a lot of people's morals, especially in the South.
And a slight exaggeration of what they typically see as the norm.
Yeah. But still, it's funny, he's likable, and the episode continues with the family going to Bobby's Little League baseball game. And the entire scene in that car is there to establish Hank having a disapproving outlook of Peggy's parenting style, because she just says, "You do your best." And Hank says, "No, don't do your best. You have to give 110%. But Bobby is hyper logical and very smart. And he says, "Well, what if they give 112%? What if they give more than I do?" And then it goes into a funny anecdote about how superstitious Peggy is, because the number 113 would be bad luck. Don't give 113%. So all these little elements of character building, like not only is Peggy soft, she has silly superstitious beliefs, but Hank's prudish beliefs aren't silly. He loves those, and he will vouch for this for sure. Nothing to say about that?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. I agree with your points. Yeah. What did you think of the change of art style from the first episode to subsequent episodes?
I think most of it's the same. Obviously, like they sharpened up a few things. Most noticeably, Bill's hair is shorter. But other than that, like, I think it's cleaner, and over these seasons, it does, in fact, get cleaner and cleaner. I think they do switch animation companies after a point, and so then it's very clean by the end of the 13th season. But plot-wise, baseball game is where Bobby gets the black eye, which is the core of the social services investigation. And as it would happen, it's Hank's fault, because Hank is so persistent on trying to make sure that Bobby is performing this act of being a big boy and doing the baseball game and succeeding and hitting the ball, that he's doing nothing but screaming orders at Bobby through this game. And that's sort of a time and place where you scream at people, because it's a baseball game. You're in an open stadium, you're outside, and there's a huge crowd there. So that, of course, you would need to raise your voice to tell someone to do something. But that screaming, Bobby's like, "What? I can't hear you." So Hank is saying, "Just keep your eye on the ball. Keep your eye on the ball. Don't listen to me. Don't listen to me. I'm screaming at you, but don't listen to me." Which is, I think, the epitome of hypocrisy, to not understand that the thing that you're doing is the reason why somebody's not living up to your expectations. Like, your attempt to make someone perform better is why they are performing badly.
Right.
And this is sort of a core thing of a lot of abusers. Like, I would be upset as a child. My father would scream at me to stop crying. Mm-hmm. And guess what makes me cry as an abused person?
I would imagine getting screamed at, yes.
Yes, it does make me cry almost instantly, like to this day. And so that whole mentality that, like, don't you dare show any emotion from this. You're being punished. You're not allowed to feel sad, because that's a privilege, I guess. It's a really messed up thing that made me feel like this was actually abuse even more so.
Right.
After the baseball game, they stop by the Megalo Mart, and in the store, Hank is obviously uncomfortable there, makes it very clear he hates going there. Mm-hmm. He encounters Buckley, who's rather incompetent at his job, but Hank is incompetent at navigating the store. So he's just trying to find the hardware department, and the animators definitely made it look like he's already in it, which I don't know if they realized.
Probably.
Because if he's asking where the hardware department is while he's standing in it, how blind are you to your surroundings, sir? But yeah, so he starts screaming. Neighbors from the next street over are in the same aisle, and they are noting how violently he's screaming. Not only is he screaming at an employee in a big box store, he is threatening this person with violence, saying you will kick his ass. And saying you're going to kick somebody's ass may be the most generic sort of threat to throw at someone, and maybe nobody actually means it when they say it, but that's still a verbal threat of violence,
Yes,
and
it's a
nobody
verbal
deserves to
threat
have
of
that
physical
flung at them.
violence.
Yeah, that's nobody deserves to be screamed at, period. But nobody deserves to have threats of violence screamed at them in exchange for sucking at their job. Just go to the manager and complain if you really need to.
I
But
think
okay, so the ladies.
my impression of that particular scene is a lot, especially a lot of older people. As you know, I live with my grandparents, and I'm subject to their whims and their fancies. But my impression with that particular scene is, at least from the area of the audience that they're trying to go to, the typical Southerner person. He's a hardworking dude. He's coming in. He talks to the guy who really doesn't know some of what he's doing there, Buckley, who's basically, the regular guy who's providing services, but providing minimal service in his eyes, in any way. And I think what a lot of people, especially from the older demographic, would like to do is scream at them and say that I'm going to kick your ass, but they don't. And I think that was probably fulfilling a little bit of that older person's fantasy of, this is what I'd like to tell some of these young people, but I never do. And
Yeah, that's
I think
interesting.
that's why they probably found that that would be funny, and that's
Well,
kind of
that's how it ends up so likable at the end of all this.
right. But
People put themselves in the shoes of the person who's frustrated and not in the shoes of the person who's literally being abused.
correct. I think that's where they were coming from with that joke, and it is kind of a shame I didn't rewatch it. I binge watched the first 3 episodes to sort of get impressionism over the system, but yeah, I probably should have watched the first episode over again for more clarity. But yeah, from my impression, the entire character of Buckley is basically the younger teenager slash 20-year-old person, and how the older generation doesn't really relate to them, and some habits which aren't necessarily bad habits, but how some of his habits get on Hank's nerves. It's sort of like a
Yeah.
power fantasy of how Hank abuses Buckley. It doesn't make it right, but I believe that's where the appeal came from.
Yeah, for sure. That was something that I was having trouble wrapping my mind around, is how people can still like Hank after seeing this episode, because I obviously have my personal experiences that are skewing my opinion of it, my
Hmm.
perspective of it.
But they are
Um,
valid. I mean, he's literally just yelling at a guy trying to do his job, and
yeah,
in the real world, that would be completely unacceptable, or
for
should be.
sure.
But I think
And
where the comedy comes in is the generational gap. I think that's what they were trying to do, at least.
in an episode which had only the only plot in this episode, there's no side plots,
Hmm.
is that Hank is being investigated by Child Protective Services for possibly, allegedly, abusing Bobby to the point where he got a black eye.
Right.
And this is a review from the 1st of August, 2009,
Hmm.
from IMDb, of this particular episode, not a review of the whole series, but it's just the last paragraph. Anyway, like I said, this is basically a very unfortunate time for Hank. And we know before Hank that he is going to have a really bad time. We see how a couple women see a very upset Hank and a Bobby with a black eye. So, misinterpretation, mouth to mouth information, gossip, and all of that, and with a public worker investigating Hank. So, to call this a very unfortunate time for Hank means that you obviously side with him.
Hmm.
And I think that can come from a presupposition that there's no way a cartoon would put out a pilot about abuse directly or
Correct.
show any actual abuse.
Correct.
There's a sitcom that's out and it's on TV, and of course it's not so serious that it's actually tackling the issue of abuse. So this is obviously, let's make fun of pencil-necked bureaucrats, and let's make fun of the shitty guy who works at the Walmart, and let's make fun of all of these things that are frustrating in daily life, because I can't relate to being investigated by Child Protective Services,
Hmm.
especially with the context being given that it's unnecessary, because the only time I've ever had to interact with Child Protective Services is when it was wildly necessary, but that the experience with them was that they did not do enough. So to introduce a character who is paranoid and who is extremely worried and is believing all of what he's being told, which is apparently gossip and exaggeration and just guesses, to introduce a character who is so paranoid, he did not do his job.
Correct.
And that's pretty relatable. Like, I related more to that than I did to anything else in the episode, because you try to call on people that you think are going to come in and help the situation, and in the end, they either are so overworked that they don't have the capacity to handle anything that you are going through, or they are literally so jaded at this point that they don't care.
Yes.
And there's a huge lack of resources in that system.
There's actually a very huge lack of resources in that system. I took several classes that were taught by the heads of the county Child Protective Services, and what you say is absolutely true, especially being jaded. The point that they have gotten to with Child Protective Services, because they are so underfunded and so undermanned, is basically if there's food, water, clothing, and heat available for the kid, they'll leave them with the parents because there's nowhere else to put them, and that's horrible.
Yes, and that's mostly because the foster care system is also incredibly underfunded, lacks resources, and people exploit that system and take on children they don't have an actual interest in caring for.
True.
And as long as they are alive still, they'll leave them there.
Yeah, but
so to say,
no, I'm just saying, just imagine a system where we were actually proactive with children being emotionally abused, mentally abused, not necessarily physically abused, obviously, because after a certain threshold, they would have to step in. But the whole point is
yes,
the psychological damage occurring to kids at their formative age. Can you imagine how many less problems we'd have in society if we actually took an interest in it?
It would probably help a lot, honestly. And that's something I do frequently come to as a conclusion after hearing the news or hearing recent events as of late. People are coming out as having been abused. Typically, yes, sexual abuse is what they're talking about. But we literally see a scene in this episode. Peggy is begging Hank to sit down with Bobby because he realized, oh, my dad's got the pressure on him from Child Protective Services, so he can't yell at me anymore, which means I don't get disciplined anymore, which means I can do whatever my impulses want. And so he starts acting out on every impulse and literally saying, my dad can't do boo about it. And so I see that moment where Hank's like, I need to be a dad to my son, and I need to reassure him that he has my love and that I want to keep him and I want to retain custody of him and that I love him. Peggy's saying, all you have to do is tell him that you love him. And Hank says, you know how I was raised? We literally see a flashback of the verbal abuse that Hank endures as a child from Cotton Hill. Yes. And so the abused child becomes an abusive parent. This is what happens in real life. And it's such a really telling plot point to bring that up. It's so real and it's so common. And I've seen that so many times. And I know in my life and in my friends' lives, that is literally what happened, is that the people that abused you were abused themselves. So to bring that up in a situational comedy, I wasn't laughing through this. You know, I've watched this a million times, but this didn't make me laugh. And I don't particularly enjoy watching the first season very much because it's pretty rough still. Right. But this episode, actually sitting down and trying to do a little analysis of it, was horrifying and sad. Like, the social worker arrives and is talking to Peggy, and Bobby's been bouncing a baseball against the wall because I think he's in a little bit of a rut, feeling down and feeling like he didn't do so good at the baseball game. Mm-hmm. But Hank just had a screaming match with Dale because Dale dropped the hood of his truck onto his back, injuring him. So Hank runs into the house in a fury and screams at Bobby to stop bouncing that ball and making that noise, grabs the ball out of his hand and throws it across the living room away from Bobby. And I just had an instant flashback to my 16th birthday where my dad grabbed the cake out of my fucking hand and threw it across the room, through the kitchen, and it landed directly into the trash can perfectly. Like, I didn't know my dad could fucking dunk, but like,
Yeah.
it's so traumatic. It was
Right.
so horrible, but like, I saw that exact same movement happen in the screaming fit of anger, and it was the same screaming fit of anger my dad had.
Mhm.
And this is in front of a social worker. This is
Right.
in front of someone who's coming to do an interview. Not only that, Hank ends that interview by screaming threats at the social worker and forcing him out of the house.
Right.
And that's not the way that you solve this problem. That's
No,
not the way that you retain the custody of your child.
that is
If
true.
somebody is trying to say like there's complaints, there's words around town that like this black eye might have come from you, you don't say I'm gonna fucking kick your ass, you pencil neck jerk. Like that is not how to handle the situation. And if you literally cannot contain your anger long enough to do that interview, honestly, I feel like the system would try to take custody away.
Right. Or at
But
least should.
yeah, it's debatable. Um, but yeah, at this point, Peggy had a lump on her forehead because while bouncing that ball in the house, Bobby accidentally it ended up not catching it and it
Right.
hit Peggy. And so there's the assumption that Hank has been abusing both of them, but the social worker did not bother to go check out the story that he was given by the family. The
Mhm.
whole family together says it was a baseball at the baseball game. Baseball games have tons of witnesses.
Right.
And so this
He
is
could
a
have
very
confirmed
odd,
it.
yes. And that's what his boss says. That's the grounds for firing him. And that's how we end up seeing him leaving town on a bus at the end of the episode. But the whole underlying joke is that that social worker's from Los Angeles, and so this is one of his first cases
Mhm.
in Redneck City, as he calls it.
Yeah, that's
And
another issue I wanted to bring up with you. Have you noticed many of the antagonists in King of the Hill kind of represent like the liberal, the leftist? In the case of the
yeah, and
social
I
worker, I know it has. In the episode that had the hipsters who moved into uh, the one guy's neighborhood who worked at the propane, who worked at Strickland Propane. A lot of the
yes,
antagonists
Enrique.
in it, yeah, Enrique. A lot of the antagonists tend to be like liberals, leftists, um, more open, more open ideas. But the ironic thing that I think, at least overall in the plot, is once Hank and all of his other conservative redneck buddies start to actually adapt and kind of learn to lighten up a little bit and adopt some more liberal points of view, then the situation solves itself. At least in the
Yeah,
context of the shows.
I definitely see the pattern of painting Hank as uptight and
Mhm.
then
If he loosens
trying
up,
to
yeah,
imagine what he would be made uncomfortable by, coming up with that situation, putting him in it, and then seeing how that conflict is eventually resolved. And that's usually the plot of every episode. And so having this outsider in the social worker who does not bother to do a thorough investigation of a case because of his own preconceptions
hmm
about Texas and the
hmm
people who live in Texas. Um, in response to like all of his accusations, Hank goes on a literal patriotic rant about how he's a hardworking American
hmm
who sells propane, and then he immediately demands that Peggy brings him some headache powder because he riled himself up.
yeah.
It's it's just interesting to me, like how I'm supposed to side with Hank
That
in that
that's more of
setup.
like yeah, that's more of like a patriarchal thing. And I've noticed both over the years in the show and over the years in most media sitcoms, they've toned that down. Usually,
Yeah,
you're absolutely right. Back in the day, being the hardworking man the hardworking white man, of course, was the epitome. That was the cream of the crop. Basically, if you were the hardworking dude providing for your family, you could essentially do no wrong. And I think one of the good things I've seen over the years is that's actually been softened. Hasn't completely been eliminated, but it has been softened.
Of course. Yeah, it's in the end, this is one of the reasons why I don't honestly think Hank is a good person. And instead, I think that the whole point is to frame him as a hypocrite who is constantly confronted with his own hypocrisy and has to adapt.
Right.
And so, yes, you need to make him likable for the show, for people to want to watch the show. And so then you need to give him antagonists that he doesn't like, that he has to battle against.
Right.
But end of the day, I don't like the social worker because he did a very bad job and doesn't actually care about the people involved. He more so is judgmental of the people involved. And I don't like Hank because he's fucking abusive.
The other thing I don't like about the social worker isn't about the social worker's personality per se. It's a fact of, well, it's true throughout the series. They're always caricature villains. They're not like a fully fleshed out antagonist who's not necessarily a good or a bad person, just a three-dimensional person. It's always the slender little pasty white dude from L.A. versus the redneck man. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's all pretty silly. But at the end of the day, I was sitting here wondering, where are the lines in verbal abuse? Because honestly, I can't handle yelling whatsoever. My neighbors constantly have screaming matches, and I just have to live with headphones on because I can't handle hearing it. But it's usually the woman screaming downstairs, and what she says and what she screams, I agree with. She's usually saying, "Don't touch me. Don't touch my food. That's my clothes. Why are you messing with my clothing?" Mm-hmm. And literally yesterday morning at 5 a.m. screaming for the gentleman to get his dirty dick away from her. So she's expressing boundaries in the most abusive way possible at the top of her lungs. So literally everyone in this building can hear her. So at the same time, I respect her right to bodily autonomy. I respect her right to not have her shit messed with. Right. And I respect all that. But I am living with PTSD and I can't handle hearing that tone. I can't handle hearing that volume, and I don't want to know your business. It's very hurtful for me, but I feel like, as proved by the reviews on IMDb, the people who are watching this see all of this as perfectly normal behavior. So the research I did, the minimal research I did, is from a book called The Verbally Abusive Relationship. It's by Patricia Evans, came out in 2009. So it's actually 10 years after this show started. In one of the chapters, they outline 15 behaviors, like individual breakdown actions that happen with verbal abuse. And obviously not all verbal abuse is the same, and not all of it is screaming, not all of it is anger, not all of it is someone could just call you bad names, but do so calmly and do so cruelly and horribly and hurtfully, but without raising their voice ever. Right. So I went through that list after watching this episode through a few times. And so I tried to figure out how many of these 15 does Hank actually do? And I compared that to the pilot, and I compared it to my remembering of the rest of the series. So out of the 15, there are examples of 7 in this pilot.
That's quite a few.
That is almost half.
Yes.
And so, half. Number 1, withholding. And that can be reduced to a failure to share thoughts and feelings.
Which is typical of Hank throughout everything, yeah.
Throughout everything. That's exactly Hank. He has to force himself to say that, I love you no matter what you do. To Bobby, at the very end of the episode, as a resolution, because he almost lost custody of him.
Right.
And Bobby's been acting out and misbehaving, and it cannot continue. So that is the last resort for Hank, to actually say something to Bobby other than standard facts, other than lectures and discipline, other than pep talks at the baseball game, anything about emotions, feelings, thoughts. he withholds.
Right.
And that is something that really can mess up children. Like, I know this for a fact. It can really, really mess with you when you're just waiting to hear something that they say on TV all the time. Normal people say it to their kids all the time. Why don't I get to hear that?
Right.
And Bobby is convinced that Hank doesn't love him.
Yes.
And that is why he needs to hear it, because it has been withheld probably for most of Bobby's life. Number two, countering. Convince someone that their feelings are wrong. To say one thing and to not confirm and validate someone's feelings, but instead to counter them.
Right.
Hank does this when he's in his moralistic disciplinarian sort of kick. And to tell a kid that like crank yankers and shit is inappropriate, like, I'm not a parent. You can decide what content is good for your kids, but it was fart noises on a tape. And to tell a kid that this is not funny, not only is it not funny, the people on that tape have a medical disorder. And to try to convince him that there is nothing good about the things that he likes is almost gaslighting. It's a weird manipulation. Obviously, Bobby loves comedy and Bobby loves these tapes. And to counter, oh no, your feelings are wrong. Your liking of this is totally invalid. Let me explain to you why you are wrong. It's not fun. I think that you can definitely censor what your children get their hands on, but I don't see any need to censor this, honestly. It's such a puritanical thing.
Well,
and Bobby's obviously enjoying himself.
Yeah, you can also censor without quashing their entire dreams. That's the other point.
Yeah.
You can think fart noises are lowbrow humor and maybe up your game a little from that, son, but you don't have to squash everything they want at every turn.
Yes. And literally trying to say that someone shouldn't enjoy what they enjoy when it's just comedy. I don't even do that when shit's problematic. I tell people literally, if you still like comedian who committed bad acts, still listen to comedian, please, because all you need to do is understand what was done wrong and why it's wrong, and please don't do it.
Right.
And you can do all of that while still being a fan. Number 3, threatening. Duh. Hank does this in almost every episode, threatening to kick somebody's ass, and often literally does assault people.
It's basically
Number 4, name calling. Name calling. I noticed that Hank will do this to his buddies, to the social worker, but he will not do this to his actual family. The only thing he will say is that boy ain't right, and he says that away from Bobby behind his back, privately. So the name calling is not something that he feels appropriate for his family.
Right.
Number 5, ordering, like demanding that somebody does something. The only time I've really seen this was Hank asking for Peggy to go get his BC headache powder. And there's a few other times that Hank has demanded or impolitely requested a meal or something of the sort from Peggy. And several times she just sasses him back and says, well, you can do that yourself. And then he'll push the button on the microwave. There's some goofs around that. And that's a very traditional jerk move by Southern dads, I would think, to expect their food on the table and to order their wives around.
Yeah, it's also indicative of old married couples who know their wives will absolutely not follow them if they are dicked around, and they'll end up having to do it themselves.
Something about older generations makes me really uncomfortable. Like, sometimes their sense of humor, specifically the culture around marriage. Like, I saw some cake toppers that were literally bride and groom, like the groom trying to run away and the bride holding him back or dragging him back on top. And that whole I don't want to be married shtick is so frightening to me, that it's normalized and people think it's funny. I do not by any means.
Yeah, I've always found distaste with like the whole cold feet excuse too.
yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff around that. On top of it, I'm at work the other night. There's two women who came in for their dinner reservation, party of four. Their husbands were parking the car.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, there's not a lot of parking, so people have to go down the block and walk a block, and that takes 5 minutes maybe.
Mhm.
So the gentleman came in and said that they were looking for their wives who had just come in, and I
Mhm.
said, "Oh, is it this name for the party? I can take you to the table." And I pointed to the table and I said something like, "Hopefully these are the right people." And this gentleman literally said, "Can we get some better ones or some better looking ones?"
Mhm.
They were elderly couples, and honestly, who the fuck are you, ugly ass man, to say
Yeah.
that about your wife? She at least dressed up for that dinner. You fucking asshole. I was so angry. I just looked at him and I guess my smile dropped and I just decided to walk before he realized how fucking offended I was. But I felt so bad for those ladies. They were just trying to enjoy their dinner. I
Right.
don't know them from anyone. But to say that in public to an employee of the restaurant that you're trying to have a Saturday night dinner at after the opera,
Mhm.
it's horrifying. Like, if that were me, if I were the wife, I would probably be very upset, have some words, and be so embarrassed that I wouldn't want to continue my dinner.
Right.
Honestly, if that had been said about me, but they take it because they want to. They were comfortable with it, and it's been normalized enough that they don't care.
Yeah, old person senses of humor I've noticed can get into the uncomfortable zone real quick.
And I don't even know if it was a joke.
I'm pretty sure it was because I've heard old people joke horribly like that, but the term poor taste, it kind of eclipses that and absorbs it and goes way beyond. It
Well, my
has
point is not to
devoured
say
poor
that
taste.
obviously he was trying to get a rise out of me and trying to make a goof. I
Yeah,
don't know if he believes it or not. The question of,
very
does this
likely,
man still find his wife attractive at 60?
very,
Probably not from what he's saying.
very likely he was trying to make a goof, but it was just bad.
It it felt more like he was just being blatantly honest with me because he had no filter. Like
That's
he
possible too.
literally would just prefer to have prettier people to sit with. Like
That's
the
possible
name
too, because I do
calling,
know a couple of old people who don't give a shit what they say.
right? That's what the vibe I was getting from him. And so like that's verbal abuse, even though
Oh yes, it
it
is. I absolutely agree.
was not angry screaming. That's fucking verbal abuse. And in public, like, oh, it's horrible. So, okay, down the list. Ordering. And number six, denial. When they are discussing with the social worker the accusations that have been made and the investigation that needs to happen, Hank is completely in denial that there is any abusive behavior going on. And in part, I do think that is because he is only thinking about physical abuse. And a lot of the time, people don't take into account that verbal abuse is also abuse.
Yeah.
And beyond verbal abuse, that there's also just emotional abuse.
Hmm.
There's lots of types of abuse and lots of manifestations that can come. And without that understanding, without that sort of terminology under your belt, if somebody asks Hank if he ever abused Bobby, of course, no. But this conversation is centered around hitting. I think that his denial of how horrible he is and how bad he is and his anger problem in general is definitely there. And he instead paints himself as a fucking patriotic hero in
Hmm.
response, which is some glorifying bullshit that abusers do for
Yes.
sure. If they're not self-deprecating, then they are glorifying
Yeah.
themselves.
Deification
Uh,
complex. Yes, they do that all the time. Or they always do, woe is me, everything is against me, I'm trying to do the best I can. Yeah.
Sometimes both.
Hmm.
Number seven is abusive anger, which obviously,
Yeah.
um, whenever Hank is brought to any kind of anger, he starts raising his voice. And it's more often with non family people. And more often that will come with threats of physical harm. But when it comes to Bobby, of course, he is not into spanking.
Mm.
It's later revealed in an episode that not only Hank, but Dale, Bill, and Boomhauer were all spanked in their elementary school by the principal with a oak paddle.
Mm.
And Peggy ends up inheriting this, and this is after she burst out in anger and beat Dooley for pantsing her in the middle of class. Of course, being pantsed, literally having your pants ripped off of you in front of 30 children, is humiliating. So she didn't know what else to do other than to throw Dooley over her knee and spank him. And then she got fired. And then all of the old vets at the VFW literally called up their old principal who used to beat Hank, got the paddle, and did this whole thing to get her reinstated. So Hank's response to the experience of being spanked when that episode comes along is very negative. He is extremely traumatized by it. Not only that, but the rest of his friends are too. And so Peggy shows up wielding it, smacking it against her hand, and they all instantly, their posture changes, their faces change. They are brought back in time to being children who are being beaten with an oak paddle. And so I don't think that Hank actually has an interest in physical abuse of his child by any means as a disciplinary action. He learned that that didn't do much for him, and he doesn't think that it would do much for Bobby. But this verbal abuse is pervasive. Even though he softens up in later seasons, he still screams. He still is prone to fits of anger that
Right.
he is not in control of. And a parent being out of control of their emotions and going on a tirade, almost a tantrum,
Hmm.
is something that is, I think it's difficult for children a lot of time, but it also normalizes that behavior, and then you end up repeating that behavior. So it's
Well, my other
it's
point,
still a very serious thing.
my other point that I wanted to bring up to you about his angry tirades is the one episode. You remember where he befriended the man with who made dollhouse furniture?
Yeah, and he was actually in an
In anger
anger
management classes, yes.
management class. Yes.
And and he decided to take the anger management classes because his friend with the dollhouse furniture ended up dying of a heart attack due to a tirade that he went on. Hank didn't want to suffer a similar fate, but then he was like vindicated for his tirades because supposedly his friends were such boobs they needed help. But basically, the entire message of that one show was being angry is great.
Yes. I obviously don't agree with that message.
Yeah.
And I think that you can definitely make a funny plot around it, but at the end of the day, it is much healthier to deal with your problems in another way. It's much
Right.
healthier to communicate with your family once you've calmed down, once you've
Right.
been able to collect your thoughts better, and once you've been able to process things. I think that speaking up when there's a problem and having confrontations is not the same as verbal abuse. That's not
No.
the same as having abusive anger. I have definitely had to confront people in a lot of situations, usually work related,
Hmm.
and have uncomfortable conversations. But I've also had to do that when I had a community organization and I had to literally ban people from it for being abusive.
Right.
And those were moments where I was prepared to be accused of being a bad person just for speaking up.
Right.
And I think that's the point that they would try to make in that episode, is that you shouldn't just let people get away with bullshit. Of course, speak
Right.
up if you know better. Speak up if you can help someone with their situation and you can help them do better. You don't need to be a jerk when you do it, though.
Right.
And they don't make that point, and they
There's a
don't
good
come
way to
full
confront
circle.
people. Yeah, there's a good way to confront people and a wrong way to confront people, and they never address the fact that the way Hank was confronting people was still wrong, even though he saved their lives. He still
Yeah.
didn't deal with his anger issues. He still had anger issues, and he didn't figure out a healthier way, at least a healthier way to resolve things. He was just back to the old go with the flow and was
Yeah, and
caught
I
as a
think
hero.
that's part of my whole theory on the perpetual hypocrite,
Hmm.
because Hank is all about telling people what the right way for everything is. Let me tell Bobby not to do this. Yes, to do this. Play baseball in this way. Don't listen to these things. Yes, do this. Don't do that. And he'll do that for his friends too, bark these orders at them. But when it comes to his own behavior, when it comes to his own life, he is very slow to correct his own actions. And it's something that is pretty uncomfortable for me to watch. And I think when I watch seasons, I might start at like season 6 and do the later ones. The early ones have some great moments, but like there is a different vibe to how Hank handles his shit. And I much prefer the calm, reasonable, slow to anger Hank than I prefer this tirade Hank.
Right.
And it's another thing I definitely have experienced with abusive people, is that there's two sides.
Mm-hmm.
And that's usually when there's also substance abuse issues, because I would see a personality shift with use of substance. So when they were in a different mode because of alcohol or because of drugs, then all boundaries were just gone. So abusive things could be said and there were no consequences and it didn't matter, and who cares? So I kind of see that in Hank, and I definitely want to get away from it now. Like I spent the whole morning sort of digging my teeth into it, but I love this show so much. I have a long history of analyzing this show for little plot holes or little inconsistencies that they make, or little mistakes that they'll make in things. And it was sort of my pride and joy to be able to watch it with people and say, oh, in this frame there's this, but it's gone in the next frame. You know, like I could know it so well in and out that I could point out exceptionally minute details of failures on the animation team for consistency, or failures in the plot. There's plot holes for Peggy's background that I know of, and all this stuff. So this is the first time I'm really kind of taking it seriously with a watch through, and I am ruining the show for myself now. I was always told that just by pointing out those little things in the writing or in the animation, that was ruining it for people. Not always. Some people enjoyed it.
I disagree. I think
people can decide for themselves if that ruins it for them. I don't get to decide that.
Right.
But they would just ask me to stop, and I would stop, which is fine. I can do that. But I'm realizing I'm ruining it for myself with thinking so seriously about these actions, and then being reminded of my own past and my current and all of these instances of abuse that I've lived through, specifically verbal abuse. So I am excited to see the next episode, which is all about sex ed.
Oh yeah, I remember the sex ed episode.
Remember?
Yes.
Not to give everything away, but Peggy is asked to substitute teach the sex ed lesson for Bobby's class. And that is a very Peggy-centric episode. I love Peggy-centric episodes, but I also have so many problems with Peggy. And I have so much to say about Peggy. And I've had people try to analyze Peggy with me, you know, give me their perspective on her and her ego and her insecurities and her over-esteem.
Well, I think that's basically Peggy's. She has other problems, but I think her main source of problem is she has pride. She's very proud of herself. And
yeah,
while that can be a really good thing in many, many aspects of life, over pride can be very, not obnoxious, but detrimental.
Yeah. But yeah, I definitely will probably not be watching the pilot again anytime soon.
Understandable.
I'm gonna give it a rest. I'm gonna give it a breather, and I'm gonna try to come back to it another time when I'm not in such an analytical mindset, and just watch it as entertainment again. Try to enjoy the goofs again, because while these are definitely important things to discuss. I don't think that abuse should be normalized.
No.
I don't think that abuse should be the core plot of a sitcom.
And that's one of the
I'm
main problems I've always had with The Simpsons and Family Guy.
Yes,
Abuse is a
it's so
huge
common.
center. Now, to be fair, the Homer Simpson physically choking Bart has gone way out of style for a while, but that used to be
Yeah,
a main-centric plot. It
tossing Meg down the fucking stairs and
well,
making some sort of slapstick allusions to the abuse of Meg on Family Guy.
the entire character of Meg is just an abuse
A
dumping
punching
ground.
bag.
Yeah,
She's a
which
fucking punching bag.
is not good. One,
Like
I
Mila
never found
Kunis,
it funny.
how do you let yourself cash those checks? Do you not understand how this perpetuates all violence against women and normalizes it constantly?
Yeah. Violence against women and the habit of a family turning one person into the punching bag, into the let's all take our turn on this person because their life's worse than ours now. And that's a very, very
And
toxic situation in a family unit.
I was I was doing this prep and I was wondering like, okay, this is our first episode,
Hmm.
Beyond the Hill.
Yep.
What if we get some listeners who want to try to argue that this is not a big deal?
Well, it's for entertainment value only. Any of your opinions on what you like or what you don't like are your own. We're just
No, I'm saying, what
eh,
if somebody comes in with their comment
mhm.
and says, "You're wrong. This is not abusive."
Well, they're entitled to their
When
opinion.
I've just spoken for like an hour about abuse.
They're
There's some people who literally have this so normalized for them
right,
that they would disagree with all of my points and all of my analysis and say that no, Hank's not abusive. And I I think that that's the reason why I want to say these things. Like
right,
that's that normalization and that misconception that this is okay is what I want to fight against. And even if it ruins it for myself and even if it might ruin it for some other people, I think that it honestly does benefit a greater good in a
right,
way that I can see this as an adult now, watch this episode and say that's wrong.
right.
I think that's something a lot of people should be able to do.
And actually see it
And
with a clear head and not just say, "Oh, I'm going to suspend disbelief because it's a cartoon." Say, "No, that's kind of unacceptable behavior."
yeah, that's my only point. I really, at the end of the day, I just want screaming at people to be considered unacceptable. I
Right.
don't think it should be the butt of a joke.
Mm.
I don't think it should be the core plot of this fucking episode. Um, and so in the end, like, yeah, I didn't have fun with this episode, but that's okay.
Yeah,
I'm
luckily it
I'm
gets
gonna come
better.
back. It gets so much better. I I definitely recommend King of the Hill to everyone in my life. And I know that commercially
Mhm.
it did not do very well on the coasts because I think there was a combination of lack of interest
Mm.
in Midwestern culture, but also lack of understanding of
That's
Midwestern culture.
I agree with that.
So it came off as dry and humorless to them. And for me, it was such a good reflection of my home life, even though I was not raised in Texas,
Right.
that I related it to it and fell in love with it instantly and have maintained my love since 97 or whenever it came out. And yeah, I definitely encourage people to watch it despite all of my negativity.
Hey, it's just the first episode. They had some kinks to work out.
Yeah. They definitely changed a lot of stuff, so
I would
check
say,
out everything after the pilot.
yeah, I would say my favorite character-centric episodes are Peggy episodes, Dale Gribble episodes, and probably Bobby-centric episodes.
At the moment, like, John Redcorn's always been a favorite character of mine for multiple reasons. Mostly that he started out as a joke
Mhm.
and then he was later considered so interesting by the writers that they expanded his character
Right.
gave him a better background, gave him his own episodes, gave him his own plot lines, and his story is wild
Yes.
and goes so many places. And we see struggles with depression in him. We see the struggles with custody of his illegitimate child with him. And so I I definitely love John Redcorn
Right.
more than probably anyone else on the show.
No, I love John Redcorn too. The other glaring question is, can you name another Native American character on any sitcom?
Good point. There's also the fact that they have neighbors that are Laotian,
Yes.
Asian American, not character, I guess characters. The actors are not Asian American except for Lauren Tom, but um, yeah, that always made me really upset that Khan was the same voice actor as Cottonhill. But
Hmm.
to have characters representing Asian
Yeah.
Americans is usually as rare, if not a little more common, I guess, than Native Americans.
And I'll save my commentary on that one for another episode, but the fact that they actually brought up the joke of, are you Chinese or Japanese? And no, we're from
Yeah.
Laos. We're from an entirely different culture, landlocked near
That you
China.
fucking never heard of.
Yeah. So are you Chinese or Japanese?
Ugh.
But back in the
Anyway,
90s, that was very unheard of for people to do that. For them to actually call out, yes, there are different cultures, and we are not cookie cutter, and we are not a caricature.
I definitely appreciate their culture critiques. Anyway, this has been Beyond the Hill.
Yes, thank you for joining
And
us.
yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for listening. And our hope is to do this weekly,
Yep.
I believe.
Yep.
I've been Salem. I've always been Salem, but for this podcast, I've been Salem.
And I'm JP. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.